He was a prisoner, a predator, and then a commander. Oskar Dirlewanger was unleashed by Heinrich Himmler to do what others wouldn't. Burn villages, kill civilians, crush entire communities without any limits or consequences. And when the war ended, justice never followed in a way many would expect. Instead, he was beaten to death by other prisoners. And years later, when his coffin was opened, even that ending started to feel uncertain. Dirlewanger was born on September 26, 1895 in the German city of Würzburg, at a time when Germany was still an empire under Kaiser rule. His family wasn't poor, and nothing in his early childhood clearly pointed to the kind of life he would later live. He went to school, followed a normal path, and like many young men of his generation, he grew up in a society that valued discipline, obedience, and military service. When World War I broke out in 1914, Dirlewanger was still a teenager, but like many others, he quickly joined the army. War at that time was seen as something honorable, but the reality he stepped into was brutal and unforgiving. During the war, Dirlewanger served on the front lines, where fighting was constant and survival was never guaranteed. He was wounded several times, which shows he was directly exposed to violence again and again. He was awarded the Iron Cross, which was given for bravery, but these kind of experiences often came with a heavy psychological cost. The war ended in 1918 with Germany's defeat, and the country went through massive political and economic chaos. Soldiers returned home not as heroes, but as part of a defeated nation struggling with humiliation, unemployment, and instability. For many veterans, including Dirlewanger, adjusting back to normal life was difficult, and some never really managed it. After the war, Germany entered a period known as the Weimar Republic, which was filled with political unrest. Street fights between left-wing and right-wing groups were common, and armed militias formed across the country. Dirlewanger didn't stay out of this. He joined right-wing paramilitary groups, including units connected to the Freikorps, which were known for their violent methods. These groups were often used to crush uprisings, especially from communist groups, and they operated with a level of brutality that went beyond normal policing. At the same time, he continued his education and eventually earned a doctorate in political science from the University of Frankfurt in the early 1920s. On paper, he was someone who could have taken a stable path in life. But instead of moving away from violence, he stayed close to it. As the 1920s moved into the 1930s, Germany's situation got worse. Economic collapse, unemployment, and political fighting created the perfect conditions for extremist movements to grow. This is where Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party started gaining serious support. Their message of rebuilding Germany and restoring pride appealed to many frustrated citizens, especially veterans like Dirlewanger. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933, the same year Hitler came to power, and this gave him a new sense of direction. The system he was entering valued loyalty and aggression, but even in a system like that, there were limits, and Dirlewanger crossed one of the biggest lines possible. In 1934, he was arrested and convicted for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl. This was not something that could be brushed aside easily, even in Nazi Germany. The regime was strict about maintaining its public image, and crimes like this were taken seriously, at least on the surface. He was sentenced to prison, stripped of his titles, and expelled from the Nazi Party. On paper, his career was finished. But he had a relationship with Gottlob Berger, who was a senior figure in the SS and had influence within the Nazi leadership. Berger had known Dirlewanger from earlier years and saw him differently. He didn't see a disgraced criminal who should be removed. He saw someone who could be useful in a system that increasingly relied on fear and violence. Berger took Dirlewanger's case to Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany and the leader of the SS. Himmler was not interested in personal morality when it came to selecting people for certain roles. What mattered to him was usefulness. He was building an organization that would enforce Nazi control across Europe, and that required men willing to do extreme things without questioning orders. So instead of leaving Dirlewanger in prison, they arranged for his release. His punishment was quietly reduced, and his record was essentially pushed aside. This wasn't a public decision. Dirlewanger was even sent to fight in the Spanish Civil War for a period, which helped rebuild his standing within the Nazi system. By the time he returned, his past crime had not disappeared, but it had been overshadowed by his usefulness. By 1940, World War II was already spreading across Europe, and Nazi Germany was expanding its control into new territories. As resistance movements began forming in occupied areas, the SS needed units that could operate in rough environments, especially forests and rural regions where regular troops struggled. This is where Dirlewanger came in. He was given command of a small special unit that was originally made up of convicted poachers. Poachers were experienced in tracking, hunting, and surviving in wooded areas, which made them useful for anti-partisan warfare. At the beginning, this unit was relatively small and was seen as an experiment. It was often referred to as a penal unit because its members were criminals who were given a chance to reduce their sentences through military service. But very quickly, the idea started to change. Instead of limiting recruitment to poachers, the SS began expanding the criteria. More prisoners were brought in, including thieves, violent offenders, and eventually people convicted of serious crimes like murder. Over time, even political prisoners and concentration camp inmates were added to the ranks. This shift changed the nature of the unit completely. Dirlewanger was the perfect leader for this kind of group because he didn't try to control their behavior in a traditional military way. The structure of the unit also grew. What started as a small battalion expanded into a larger formation, eventually becoming known as the Dirlewanger Brigade. It operated under the SS, but didn't behave like a normal military force. By the time Dirlewanger and his unit were deployed in occupied Poland, the situation was already tense. His brigade wasn't sent there to fight traditional battles. They were sent to deal with the partisans, which meant operating in villages, forests, and rural areas, where resistance fighters were believed to hide. But from the very beginning, the way they handled this mission went far beyond targeting actual fighters. If a village was even suspected of helping partisans, that was enough. Dirlewanger's men would surround the area, force people out of their homes, and then begin a process that became all too common. Men were often separated first, questioned briefly if at all, and then executed. Women, children, and the elderly were not spared. Houses were looted for anything valuable and then burned down, sometimes with people still inside. There was no system, no proper investigation, no attempt to confirm who was actually involved in resistance. Suspicion alone was treated as guilt. What made this even more disturbing was how open it was. Officers from the regular army, and even some within the SS, began reporting what they were seeing. Complaints described uncontrolled violence, drunken behavior, and actions that went beyond even the harsh policies already in place. But when these reports reached higher command, the reaction wasn't what those officers expected. Instead of stopping Dirlewanger, leaders focused on the results. Resistance activity in those areas had dropped, at least temporarily, and fear spread quickly among the population. So instead of punishment, Dirlewanger was given more freedom and more responsibility. His unit's behavior was now being quietly accepted because it served a purpose. Between 1941 and 1944, after Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, Dirlewanger's brigade was heavily deployed in Belarus, a region that quickly became one of the main centers of partisan resistance. The forests in Belarus were thick and difficult to control, which made them ideal for resistance fighters who carried out ambushes and sabotage operations against German forces. For the Nazis, this kind of warfare was frustrating because it wasn't a clear frontline battle. They couldn't easily identify who the enemy was, so they turned to a strategy that focused on terror. Dirlewanger's unit became a key of these anti-partisan operations, but the way they operated turned these missions into something far more destructive. Their approach followed a pattern that repeated again and again. They would move into a village, often based on intelligence that was weak or unreliable, and accused the entire population of supporting partisans, just like they had in Poland. Entire communities were wiped out in a matter of hours. Houses, barns, and churches were set on fire, sometimes after people had been locked inside. In other cases, villagers were gathered in open fields or near the edges of forests and shot in groups. The scale of these operations grew over time, especially during large campaigns, like anti-partisan sweeps, where multiple units would surround entire regions. Dirlewanger's brigade often took part in the most violent parts of these actions. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of civilians were killed in Belarus during these operations, and Dirlewanger's unit was responsible for a significant portion of that number. Some records suggest that during certain operations only a small number of actual partisans were killed, compared to the large number of civilians. And every time complaints moved up the chain of command, they ran into the same barrier: Heinrich Himmler. Himmler saw these actions differently. To him, terror was not a side effect. It was a strategy. This protection had a clear effect on Dirlewanger himself. He became more confident, more aggressive, and less concerned about any form of discipline. In August 1944, the Polish resistance launched the Warsaw Uprising, a large-scale attempt to take control of the capital city before Soviet forces could arrive. It was a bold and desperate move, involving thousands of fighters from the underground Home Army. For a brief moment, parts of Warsaw were in Polish hands again, but the German response was immediate and overwhelming. Orders were given to crush the uprising completely and to make an example out of the city. Dirlewanger's brigade was brought into Warsaw as part of this response, and they were sent specifically into the Wola district, a densely populated area filled with civilians. What happened there over the next 5 days, from early August into mid-August 1944, became known as one of the worst massacres of the entire war. The instructions given to German forces were to eliminate resistance and terrorize the population into submission. But in practice, this turned into mass killing on a huge scale. Between 40,000 and 50,000 civilians were killed in Wola in just a few days. These weren't armed fighters. Many were ordinary people who had no direct involvement in the uprising. Families were pulled from their homes, lined up against walls or in open spaces, and shot. In many cases, executions were carried out quickly and repeatedly, with groups of people being killed one after another. Hospitals weren't spared. Medical staff and patients were killed where they lay, despite being clearly unarmed and unable to fight. Buildings were set on fire, sometimes trapping people inside. The scale of destruction was so large that entire streets were filled with bodies, and fires burned continuously across the district. Survivors later described the scene as something beyond anything they had ever imagined, with the smell of smoke and death covering the area for days. And once again, there were no real consequences for him. But by late 1944 and early 1945, the war was no longer going in Germany's favor. The Western Front was collapsing under pressure from American, British, and other Allied forces, while from the east, the Soviet army was pushing forward with massive strength after years of brutal fighting. Cities were being bombed heavily, supply lines were breaking down, and entire German units were either surrendering or being destroyed. The war that had once looked like a fast and unstoppable expansion had turned into a desperate fight for survival, and even the leadership knew the end was near. Dirlewanger was still active during these final months, but the situation around him had completely changed. His brigade was now just another broken unit trying to survive on collapsing front lines. Casualties were extremely high, not just from combat, but also from exhaustion, lack of supplies, and the overall chaos of retreat. The kind of loose discipline that had defined his unit earlier now made things worse. During this period, Dirlewanger himself was wounded in combat, which limited his ability to stay in direct control. Reports suggest he was injured sometime in early 1945 while fighting on the Eastern Front, as Soviet forces advanced deeper into German-held territory. As the front lines collapsed, units like his were pushed back again and again, often without proper coordination. When Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, it marked the end of war in Europe. But for individuals like Dirlewanger, it also marked the beginning of a different kind of danger. Many SS officers knew they would be held accountable for what they'd done, so they tried to disappear. Some attempted to blend in with civilians, others used false identities, and a few managed to escape to other countries. Dirlewanger also tried to avoid being recognized, but he didn't have the time or the network that others used to successfully flee. He was eventually captured by French forces in early June 1945 near the town of Altshausen. By that point, he was no longer a commander with power or protection. For the first time in years, there was no system left to protect him. No SS command, no Himmler, no influence that could save him. But then the unexpected happened. On June 7, 1945, just weeks after the war ended, Dirlewanger died while in custody. According to most accounts, the guards responsible for watching him included Polish soldiers who had every reason to hate men like him. Many of these guards were either former prisoners, resistance members, or soldiers who had seen the destruction caused by Nazi forces firsthand. The official explanation for his death is that he was beaten to death by those guards. It wasn't a long process or formal execution. It was a sudden act of violence that ended his life before any legal action could begin. No trial, no investigation in the way modern courts would handle such a case, and no official sentencing. For many people at the time, especially those who knew about the actions of Dirlewanger's brigade, this kind of ending felt like immediate justice. After years of violence and destruction, he died in a way that seemed to reflect the brutality he had been part of. But from a historical point of view, this created a major gap. Without a trial, there was no detailed testimony from Dirlewanger himself. Historians never got the chance to question him, to understand how he justified his actions, or to confirm how much direct control he had over specific atrocities. Most of what is known about him comes from reports, witness accounts, and documents from other officers. His own voice is almost completely missing from the record, which makes it harder to fully understand the mindset behind his actions. After his death, his body was buried quickly and without any ceremony in an unmarked and poorly recorded grave. At that time, Europe was still in chaos, and dealing with thousands of captured soldiers and officers was a massive task. Proper documentation wasn't always a priority, especially for someone like Dirlewanger, whose death did not require further legal action in the eyes of those holding him. For a while, it seemed like that was the end of his story. He was gone, buried, and no longer a threat. But as the years passed and more attention was given to tracking down former Nazis, questions began to appear. Some people started to wonder if things had really been that simple, or if there was more to the story than what had been recorded at the time. Rumors began to spread that he might not have actually died in June 1945, and that he could have escaped using a different name. These rumors were not supported by strong evidence, but they were enough to raise questions, especially since his burial had been done quickly and without detailed records. In a time when many war criminals were still being tracked down, authorities decided it was worth checking. Years later, his supposed burial site was located, and the grave was opened. The remains inside were examined by experts who tried to confirm whether the body was truly that of Oskar Dirlewanger. At the time, identification methods were limited compared to modern standards. There was no DNA testing available, so experts had to rely on physical features, dental records if available, and any remaining documentation connected to the burial. The examination concluded that the remains were consistent with Dirlewanger, and most investigators accepted that he had indeed died in custody in June 1945. However, because of the conditions in which he was buried and the lack of precise records, it was difficult to reach absolute certainty. Some doubts remained, not because there was strong evidence against the conclusion, but because the post-war situation had been so disorganized that small gaps in information were common. Even with those doubts, the general agreement among historians today is that Dirlewanger did not escape, and that he died shortly after the war ended. In a strange way, the uncertainty around his burial reflects the kind of life he lived. His story didn't end with a clear and controlled conclusion, but with confusion, missing details, and unanswered questions. And that ending fits a man whose entire life was shaped by chaos, violence, and a system that allowed him to operate without limits until the very last moment.